Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. As I scroll through subscriber comments to the videos, from time to time, I see references to other names for the Civil War, typically being mentioned in context to a story that I've covered in a video that has a Confederate slant or a Union slant or somewhere in between. And I look at those comments and I think about them and process them. And they register with me, but I have never done a video about them. Recently, as I was doing some research, I came across a story by Gaines M. Foster that appeared in the Journal of the Civil War Era in the September 2018 issue. I've got it in the comments here below in case you want to check it out. The name of the story written by Mr. Foster is "What's Not in a Name? The Naming of the American Civil War." And so that led me down the research rabbit hole. I read the article and I began doing a little digging around in one of my favorite databases. If you listen to these videos regularly, newspapers.com is a big fave of mine. And so I thought, let me take a look at the references in newspapers.com to various popular names of the Civil War and try to get some sense of when they were used and in possibly which context. Now, Mr. Gaines's article talks about the Civil War, the name Civil War, being a name preferred by white Southerners as a way to make it more of a unifying theme, to get away from the Southern responsibility or the Northern responsibility, really to sort of make it more neutral. So Civil War is more of a neutralizing term. So the other names all have various times that they were used. And so using newspapers.com and typing the various names into the search field and doing a search between 1861 and 2023, I was able to get a sense of these names and their usage. And so the graphics that you see here that I'm going to show you, I've got 12 different names that I looked at. And so if you look at the graphics, you'll see very obviously the map of the United States, and the darker the highlight color of red is where the intensity of that name was used the most. Now, newspapers.com includes papers from all across the country, but of course, in the most populated states, along the coasts for the most part and into Texas is where you might see some of the darker reds. So notice those, but also notice the medium tones of red as I go through these names. You'll see what I mean as I go along. Now, beneath the US map, you'll see a line chart, and that line chart begins in 1861, ends in 2023, and then you'll see there's markers for 1900, 1950, and 2000. And the lines, as they move across those dates, give you some sense of when it was most popular, unpopular, just coming into being, fading out, ebbing and flowing. So here's a Civil War, and very much as the story written that I initially read, Mr. Foster's story, if you look at Civil War, you'll notice that it's really around 1890 or so when the Civil War actually jumps into the most popular name, and it continues and begins to decline a little bit in maybe from about 2010 onward. Now, let's take a look at another one here. This is War of the Rebellion. And for those of you students of the Civil War, you know, for example, the official records, which is perhaps the greatest single primary source about the Civil War is called the official records of the War of the Rebellion, not the Civil War. And look at the dates. The popularity from 1861 to maybe 1900, and then it begins to decline just as Civil War is beginning to skyrocket in popularity. And I'd say by 1925, it's largely faded from usage, and it continues that way under the radar until today. Now look at another one. This is Frederick Douglass's term. He called it the Slaveholders' Rebellion. And look, 1861 to about 1870, it's hugely popular, but then it quickly declines. And by 1900, it really fades out. And then if you follow the line down through the decades, you see there's a little jump probably around the 1960s, and that's around the civil rights movement. So you see Slaveholders Rebellion makes a little jump, and then it fades back into obscurity. Now, another name, War for the Union, one that you might be not as familiar with, but look at that. The War for the Union is pretty much ebbing and flowing all the way across the last 160 years. I should also be pointing out, look at the state map. You see War for the Union being used largely in the northern states and a little bit out west. Now, the Confederate War, by contrast, is also quite popular, not as popular as War for the Union, but Confederate War is percolating up and down across time. And look on the map, it's mostly centered in a single state, South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. And you'll notice the slightly darker colors of red are mostly the southern states. Now, let's go to another popular term in the South. That's the War for Southern Independence. And you'll see by the colors alone, you have the Carolinas, Virginia, all of the former Confederate states where it's most popular, barely used in the North. And look at the timeline across the bottom. It's quite popular from about 1861 to 1870, and then it declines, and it makes another jump around 1900 when Civil War is becoming popular as a term, and then it fades a little bit and pops up again in after 1950, big jump around 2000, and then begins to fade back down. Now, a term that you hear quite often, at least I do, Brothers' War. Look where the Brothers' War begins, around 1875. And let's put a pin in that for a minute. It begins around 1875. And part of this is around that time of reunification. The war is now 15 years behind us, 25 years behind us, and those veterans are getting older. They're looking at ways to sort of bring everybody together and to use a term that is more neutral. So the Civil War eventually wins the day, but Brothers' War is one of those names that's being tested out, being road tested to see how viable it might be as a name. It's an early name that is being used to try to even things out a little bit and bring North and South back together. And take a look at the map. It's moving mostly around the country, being used in the North and the South, primarily in the North. Now, one of the classics, War Between the States, notice it is also rising about the time that the Civil War as a term is growing in popularity. War of the Rebellion has clearly faded, and War Between the States is gathering some steam. But look what happens. It's getting quite popular, but it's mostly in the South, and the South alone, where that's happening. It hits its high right about World War II and then drops back down. War of the sections is another one of those terms, like Brothers' War, war between the states, war of the sections. Another way to try to neutralize it, this one, compared to war between the states, is a little bit more popular, at least in terms of being used throughout the states, but it never really catches on. It's got that bump from about, I'd say, 1925 to 1945. Now, another one that is quite popular today, War of Northern Aggression. Look at the bottom timeline. It pops up around 1960, which is right about the time that the civil rights movement is picking up full steam. And then look how it jumps up in popularity all the way to about 2000. It's a fairly steady increase. And then it begins to drop down, still popular, but still being used today. Look at the map. You'll see that by the map, it is mostly confined to the South. Couple more to show you. The War of Northern Aggression. Look at the War of Southern Aggression. This is one that I struggled when to show it to you because look, in 1861, it's pretty popular. It's right up there with the Slaveholders Rebellion and the War of the Rebellion. So the War of Southern Aggression is quite popular. And notice how it goes down, it gradually slides down all the way until about 1950, practically disappears. But when War of Northern Aggression becomes popular around 1950, look what happens. The War of Southern Aggression jumps up in popularity, two spikes, one around probably 1960, around the time of the Civil War centennial, and then it jumps up again in the early 2000s. Interesting how it's literally mimicking the War of Northern Aggression. Now, the last one to show you, and that's the Second American Revolution, which you hear occasionally nowadays, but here it pops up. Really, its heyday was from about 1960, 1970, again, around that time of the centennial, popping up in the 80s, but just for a moment and coming back down to around 2000 where it settles down. So there you have a look. I'll go back to the one we talk about most today, the Civil War, the most popular term coming into play around 1890, still popular today. So there you have it. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.